The Jets are done with their bye week. What's at stake in the second half of the season? That's what we'll talk about today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, November 14th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button wherever you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, I hope you enjoyed this Sunday with no Jets football. I guess a stress-free Sunday. Although when the Jets are good, you kind of miss them. You know, the past couple of years, the bye has been kind of nice because you did not have to watch the Jets lose. This year, it kind of feels like you did not get to see the Jets win a game. So I guess it was kind of a letdown on Sunday. At least it was for me. But plenty of Jets football left to play. And it's kind of interesting because the way the bye fell this season with a 17-game schedule, there's no official halfway point, but this was just about the halfway point. The Jets have played 9 games. There are 8 to go. It was an excellent first half of the season for the Jets. They went 6-3 before the bye. And today we're going to talk about what needs to happen for the second half of the season to be as successful, if not more successful, than the first half. Now, I think any discussion with the 2022 Jets centers around Zach Wilson. And it's kind of interesting because Zach Wilson, if you look at many of the numbers, they're actually, pretty solid. You look at his QBR, it's right around where you want it to be. The yards per attempt is solid. I mean, if you told me he'd rank where he is right now in QBR, around the middle of the pack kind of guy, a solid yards per attempt, it's kind of what you would have wanted preseason. Zach Wilson came from the very bottom of the league last year, so you're not going to go from the very bottom to the top 5. This year was about showing that you're a credible player. And by many of the numbers, Zach Wilson's done that. I think if you look at the eye test, it's a little bit less impressive. And that's because so far this season, Zach Wilson has been what I would refer to as a high variance kind of player. What do I mean by that? Well, there are some guys who give you something consistent from game to game. A guy is average, and he's just average every single week. And, maybe there's a week here or there where he's really good or really bad, but for the most part, you're getting a consistently average performance. Zach Wilson's been wildly up and down. In fact, Zach Wilson has started 6 games so far this season. And fortunately, he's 5-1. But as we know, wins are not really a quarterback stat. As much as we make them out to be, wins are really a team stat. And I would say of the 6 games, there have been 3 where I think Zach Wilson's given you what you're looking for, and then 3 that really have been pretty bad. And the Jets won 2 of the 3 games, which is a positive thing. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but Zach Wilson's been very up and down so far this season. And he's still a quarterback who's really kind of learning the ropes. And the Jets have created a good infrastructure around him because I really have come to believe, watching quarterbacks, why they succeed, why they fail in this league. A big part of it is just the ability to avoid letting failure snowball. And we saw this with Sam Darnold. And, who knows how Sam Darnold would have turned out in a better circumstance. There's still a very good chance Sam Darnold just did not have what it took to be a successful NFL quarterback. But I think one of the problems is that the Jets put him in an impossible situation where they were going to lose week after week after week. And when you lose week after week after week, whether it's fair or not, again, wins and losses are not really a quarterback stat, but that's not the perception. So the talk around the team, what you hear in the media, what you hear from the fan base, and as much as you say you want to block it out, I don't think anybody can really block it all out. And when you're losing week after week, and when you don't have the playmakers around you, and when you don't really know what you're seeing, because those first couple of years in the NFL, I mean, anybody who plays quarterback will tell you you're just trying to survive. You really don't know what you're doing yet. You're still very much in the learning process. And when you're in the learning process, you're going to make mistakes. And when those mistakes cost you games, things can just snowball. And it's very easy, I think, for a quarterback to lose faith, to lose confidence. And the fact Zach Wilson's been able to win, and this is my opinion, but in my opinion, 3 of his games have not been so good. And they won 2 of them. And why that's important to me is it means that those 2 games, we did not have to deal with what we dealt with after the New England game. Because you probably saw it if you were following what was happening in the media, and even on this podcast to a certain extent. There was a lot of criticism of Zach Wilson in those games and after that. But we only had to deal with that once this season so far. Because in the other games, even games where Zach Wilson did not play well, I'm talking Green Bay and I'm talking Denver, along with New England, those are the 3 games I think he played poorly. After Green Bay, after Denver, nobody was really talking about Zach. I mean, there was a little discussion about, I think there was even a debate, was he good, was he not? But it was not driven by Zach Wilson. And I think it's good for a quarterback to be able to kind of fly under the radar and develop. And also, I mean, another thing I'd say is statistically, the game he played against Miami, it was a solid game. It wasn't a bad game, but he averaged 10 yards per completion. And again, I think that speaks to the infrastructure the Jets have put around him, because he was solid in that game. He wasn't 10 yards per completion good. And the game last week against Buffalo, where, the numbers weren't spectacular, but I feel like if you watch the flow of the game, and, part of it's part statistics, part eye test. You looked at this, that's a game that's kind of been the opposite of the rest of the year. I just said that Zach Wilson statistically has been solid in a lot of areas. There's some statistics he's not been so great in, but in a lot of areas he's been solid statistically, but the eye test hasn't looked good. I think the Buffalo game was kind of an opposite, because statistically, he wasn't super, he had a high completion percentage, but they weren't making a lot of big plays. By the eye test, though, I think the game against Buffalo was pretty good. But you come away from these games and you feel like this is not a quarterback-dependent team. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. And when you're trying to bring along a young quarterback, especially a quarterback who's, again, still finding his way. Zach Wilson was pretty undeveloped when he got to the Jets out of BYU. It's important to be able to put him in an infrastructure where, first of all, you make it easier for him to succeed. But second, his failures don't sink the team. Now, going forward, I think you want to see Zach Wilson become a lower variance player. Now, he's not the guy at this point of his career who has the tools to lift the team on his back. And I think one of the biggest things for me going forward is you want to see Zach Wilson show an ability to play within the system. Because when Zach Wilson has played, and the games that I've mentioned where he's been solid are games where Zach Wilson has played within the system. When he came out of BYU, he was a pretty dynamic guy when he was breaking out of the pocket. He's a playmaker when he was kind of ignoring the play call, when he was rolling out, when he was evading pressure. He really has not been very dynamic. That's one aspect of his game that just has not translated to the NFL. When he breaks the pocket, the play's usually over. I mean, there have been a couple good plays, but the play's typically been over. Zach Wilson's been much better when he's played within the confines of the system. And even in the Buffalo game, there were a couple times where he made a really good play because he saw a running lane and he just took it. He wasn't trying to drift to his left or his right. But within the confines of the system, he saw there was a running lane there. He could take off. And he played within the pocket. That's what you want to see from Zach Wilson. That's what's going to lead to solid play. That's what's going to lead to success. It's not clear where the Jets' quarterback situation is going to be at the end of the year. I think Zach Wilson's going to be back on the team next year. I think he's probably going to be the starting quarterback next year, and that's right. But the question is, does Zach Wilson claim the starting job as his? Does he show the Jets and the fan base and the media over these final 8 games that he is the undisputed starting quarterback? Or is it a situation where, he's shaky, he's up and down, and maybe the Jets need to invest in a quarterback to maybe push him a little bit? That's what's at stake over the second half of the season. You really want to see Zach Wilson take command of this huddle, take command of this offense, and again, play within the system, because when he's done that this year, those have been his good games. When he's tried to break outside the structure of the play call, some quarterbacks can do it, and maybe Zach Wilson will be able to do it later in his career, but he hasn't been so good at doing it so far. So you want to see Zach Wilson master the system, and that's a key to the success for the Jets, both in the win-loss record, but also long-term going forward over the final 8 games of the season. But of course, there are other young players the Jets are looking to step up over the final 8 games. As we continue on this Monday episode of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about some of them. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Total Wine and More. It's tough to believe we are already in the holiday season, but we are. And this holiday, find out what you love at Total Wine and More. With so many great bottles to choose from, it's easy to find a new favorite single barrel bourbon or the perfect gifts for everyone on your list with some help from a friendly guide. And all with the confidence of knowing you found something special for the lowest price. Find what you love what you find. Only at Total Wine and More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly. Be 21. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. It is a rare Monday in season for the Jets where we do not have a game recap. You only get one bye each season, and then typically you get a Thursday night game, and maybe there's some Monday night games mixed in there. But usually our Monday shows are game recaps. Not this week, however, as the Jets were on their bye week. Instead, we're looking forward because the bye week fell around the halfway point of this season. Doesn't always work so cleanly. Sometimes your byes as early as week 4, week 5, but this year the Jets' bye fell right at the midway point, right around the midway point with a 17-game season. There's no official midway point. It's between game 8 and game 9. Jets are done with 9 games. And we're talking about what we need to see from the Jets to make the second half as successful, if not more successful than the first half. And I think it's key. We talked to Zach Wilson in the first segment, but the Jets have a lot of young players who are core players for this team. And you saw some excellent performances the first half of the season, and you want to see them continue. Now, unfortunately, not all the young players are on the team. Obviously, Breece Hall's out for the season. Breece Hall was running into contention for Offensive Rookie of the Year at the point he got injured. In fact, even in the game he got injured, he had a long touchdown run against Denver. He was becoming the go-to guy on offense. And of course, Elijah Vera Tucker kind of emerged. It's funny because when we talk about teams evaluating talent, sometimes teams misevaluate players because the players aren't quite as good as they think they're going to be. Elijah Vera Tucker was the type of player who kind of went the other way, where the Jets maybe misevaluated him because they did not realize how good he was going to be, because it felt like the Jets viewed him as a guard and he was showing that he could actually play tackle. So unfortunately, those guys are out, but there are some other key players for the Jets. And I think one of the things that's become obvious for the Jets, and it's obvious if you watch the league across the NFL, we spend all this time in the offseason obsessing over, we got to fill this weakness, we got to fill that weakness. That's the only way we can become a good team. It's not really about filling weaknesses. It's just having some great players. And you're seeing with the Jets this year, just a few great players can make all the difference in the world. And of course, the Jets are going to be without some of those players, but there are some other young players who have really stepped up this season. And one of the players who stepped up is Quinnen Williams, who has gone from good to great. And you want to see him maintain that level of play, because there's still a question right now. Is this a hot streak for Quinnen Williams? Is this a career year and next year he's going to go back to being a guy who's just good? Or is this a breakout season? Is this the type of season where Quinnen Williams is becoming one of the dominant players on defense in the NFL? Now, we will not have an answer to that, till the end of next season, because we got to see what Quinnen follows this year up with. But you want to see him continue this strong level of play, because he's become a one-man wrecking crew on the defensive line. The beginning of the season, I felt like the defensive line had a lot of good players. I was not sure who was that one guy, though, because you always want at least one guy who just dominates no matter what. That one guy who the offensive coordinator has to scheme around, who, even if you do that, even if you do scheme around him, you're going to have issues. And Quinnen Williams has become that guy. But the Jets are also getting that from Sauce Gardner, who, at this point, I think there are not many shutdown corners in the NFL. The Jets have one in Sauce Gardner. In fact, the Jets have borderline 2 shutdown corners with DJ Reed, but Sauce Gardner has been exceptional so far this season. And then on the offensive side of the ball, I mentioned earlier how the offense had kind of become Breece Hall's offense from the Miami game to the Green Bay game to the Denver game, and then he got hurt. And then over the last 2 weeks, it's kind of morphed into Garrett Wilson's offense, where Garrett Wilson, who had that great game week 2 against Cleveland, and then kind of disappeared. He was inconsistent, and part of it was that he's a rookie, and rookies tend to be inconsistent. It's tough to translate that to the NFL every single week when you're just fresh out of college. And part of it was that week 2 drew some attention. He drew some really tough matchups for a rookie, tough matchups for anybody. I'm talking Jair Alexander. He saw a decent chunk of Patrick Surtain when the Jets played Denver. But the last couple of weeks, you've seen Garrett Wilson kind of come back to life. And even though they played different positions, Garrett Wilson's a key component in replacing Breece Hall because Michael Carter, James Robinson, they can, to a certain extent, keep the Jets' run game solid and replicate a percentage of what Breece did on the ground. But neither of them is going to be a go-to guy on offense. Neither of them is going to be that guy on offense where the other team's got a scheme around him, and even if you scheme around him, you're going to have a tough time. And Jack Wilson, it feels like the last couple of weeks, has really developed a rapport with Garrett Wilson. And I hate to talk about injuries this way, but I think especially because of the short-term injury, I can say it. I think in some ways the injury to Corey Davis was a blessing in disguise because it's forced Zach Wilson to rely on Garrett Wilson a little bit more. And now when Corey Davis comes back, you're going to have two receivers Zach Wilson feels comfortable with, has chemistry with. I feel like that's going to make Zach Wilson better because a lot of playing quarterback in the NFL is just being able to trust the guys you're playing with. And that goes for the offensive line, which, hopefully they'll get some guys back from injury, which will help Zach out. You got to trust your offensive line can hold up because if you don't trust your offensive line and your eyes are dropping at the first sign of pressure, you're never going to complete a pass. But it's also with the receivers because you got to trust that your guy's going to end up in the spot he needs to be at. If you don't do that, you're going to be maybe double clutch. And then once you double clutch in the NFL, maybe you can get away with like delaying, with hesitating in college. Passing windows don't stay open in the NFL for very long. And one double clutch can end it all. So Garrett Wilson, it feels like Zach is developing chemistry with him. It feels like Zach is really comfortable with him now. We also know he's comfortable with Corey Davis. Now having two receivers he can trust, on a given play, the progression is typically three guys. You have your first option, your second option, and the third guy is the check down typically, most plays. So if you have two guys you can trust at the receiver position and you know where they got to be, it makes life easier. And because the third guy is just going to be the guy you dump it off to if nobody's open underneath. So Garrett Wilson, but you got to see Garrett Wilson continue to play with that consistency. And, I've really lost a lot of faith in Elijah Moore, as most of you have. But if Elijah Moore can get his head on straight and, figure things out, that certainly would help out the Jets. Of course, it's not all about developing young players. Developing young players is critical for the Jets this year. Before the start of the season, we talked about how progress was the most important thing. But I think it's fair to say at 6-3 with the win against the Buffalo Bills, expectations have been raised. And as we close out this Monday episode of Locked On Jets, we're going to talk about playoffs. You do your Jim Mora imitations now because the Jets are in position to make the playoffs if they have a strong second half. We'll talk about it more as we finish up this Monday Locked On Jets episode. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. If you're a daily fantasy sports player, you may pick the Jets. You hope that Michael Carter has more than 75 yards next week. You hope Garrett Wilson has more than 90 yards. But if you do play daily fantasy sports, let me tell you about PrizePicks. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players. And if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport you watch. So if you're not that comfortable playing daily fantasy with the NFL because you don't want to pick guys who are going up against the Jets, you can play Major League Baseball, you can play the NHL, the PGA, college football, men's and women's college basketball. You can play soccer, you can play esports, MMA, boxing, Euro basketball, cricket, and disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's just that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they are currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you another $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you another $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about expectations for the second half of the season. What can the Jets do to make the second half of 2022 as good, if not better, than the first half? And, I'm not sure I really bought into the Jets making the playoffs when the season began, but look, we're 6-3 right now. We got a 6-3 football team. At some point, you just have to say, you know what, this is a pretty good team, and things are lining up for the Jets this year. It's a very thin line in the NFL. Sometimes, some seasons, things just break your way. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a great team. I think the Jets are a good team. I don't know if they're a great team, but things are just, at least through 9 games, it feels like they've been following the Jets' way. So what do? What should your expectations be? And at this point, listen, the Jets have missed the playoffs every year since 2010. We're going on a 12-year drought. That's just too much. And it's not this team's fault, and the Jets are still at the beginning of their build. And I hear people say, well, what's the big deal? The Jets aren't going to the Super Bowl. Well, they're probably not. And you know something? Even the favorite team in the NFL, even Philadelphia, has a less than 50% chance of going to the Super Bowl. Definitely less than a 50% chance of winning the Super Bowl, because you need a lot to go right. There are other teams that could beat you along the way. You could suffer an injury. Any one team, the odds, even the favorite in the NFL, doesn't have that good of a chance of going all the way. I'm not expecting the Jets to go to the Super Bowl. I don't think they're the best team in the AFC right now. But at this point, they're one of the contenders. They're in the mix, even if they have an outside shot. But let's say they don't. You say, well, who cares if you don't go to the Super Bowl? Well, I'd say, how many times do you go straight from 4 wins to winning the championship? Typically, there are intermediate steps along the way. Now, sometimes it doesn't go straight up. Sometimes you have a down year after a good year, and that could happen to the Jets next year. But I think making the playoffs would be a big step for this team. And I know it's very difficult to prove. It's very intangible, but I think the idea of there's always the phrase building a winning culture. And I think it's important to have these guys play meaningful games, have these guys step into the intensity of a December game that matters and win some of them and get at least get themselves into the playoffs. And it's a building block. It's not necessarily something that's going to guarantee the Jets go to the Super Bowl next year. Frequently, teams fail to take the next step the next year. And frequently, sometimes what happens is you have one big season and then you fall off and you never get close again. That's actually what happened to the Jets back in 2015 when they missed the playoffs. And the next season they fell off, and the Jets have not had a winning year since. But to get to the top, I think there are some intermediate steps along the way. I think you have to focus on making the playoffs first. I mean, Kansas City, they won the Super Bowl a couple of years back. They had so many playoff disappointments in that span, but they first had to get there. And sometimes it's quicker than others. Sometimes you get there immediately and you win, but more often there are intermediate steps. There are steps you have to take along the way. And I think for the Jets, for this team right now, making the playoffs is a huge first step. It would be really big. And it's not just for the fan base. I understand that the fan base has been looking for a championship for a long time. The fan base has been looking for a championship for over 5 decades. And the fan base has been looking for a playoff game for over 1 decade. The fan base has been looking for a home playoff game if the Jets can win the AFC East for 2 decades now. So, but beyond the fan base, I think when you're talking about a young team, this is not a team that's mortgaging its future to make the playoffs. This is still a team with a lot of young players in key spots. So it could be a big first step for this team. And I don't, there's only so much it matters, because in the NFL, every single season, there's about a 50% turnover in teams that make the playoffs. About half the teams that make the playoffs the year before don't make it the next year. So it doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't guarantee you'll take that next step. But I think it would be a very big deal for this young Jets team, a team that's exceeded expectations, and especially at 6-3, because when you're 6-3 and you don't make the playoffs, it means you had a bad ending to the season. So you don't want to leave a bad taste in, a bad feeling about the way the season ended. You want to finish strong. If the Jets were, maybe something like 4-5, you would say, okay, stay competitive, finish 500. But at 6-3, you're in playoff position. You got a great shot at making it. So you want to make sure that the good feelings that began with this season do not fall apart with a bad back half of the season. And there's some games that'll be easier than others on the schedule, at least on paper. We'll see what the Jets can do with it. But I think at this point you have to say, and I'm not even sure I would have said this a few weeks ago, but I think especially after the win against Buffalo, making the playoffs is important for this team on a number of levels. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.